Hi everyone, my name is Eduardo. I'm a front-end developer freelance. I'm the author of Vue Router, Pinia, Vuefire, and other small libraries in Vue.js. I'm from Spain, but I live in Paris, where I organize the Paris Vue.js meetup. If you ever come around and you want to give a talk, send me a message on Twitter. And I've been on the Vue ecosystem for a long time. And before Pinia, we had Vuex. And Vuex was a very different state management solution. It was definitely more verbose. It was based on the Fluss architecture, and we have all these commit and dispatch all around the place. It wasn't designed with TypeScript in mind, and because of that, as we advanced into Vue 3, other things came around, like composition API. We also thought of other ways to arrange things for that composition API, and we thought other ways of arranging things for TypeScript to work well as well. So we have things like lazy loading that could come into place, and automatically type things, which was definitely not the case for Vuex. So we decided to move into Vuex 5 with these things in mind, okay? The thing is, as the RFC was being worked by the team, I was also working on Pinia, and so Vuex 5 pretty much became Pinia. Now, today, Pinia is more than 4 years old. So that gives us a lot of time to look at how Pinia is used. And today, I want to give you a disaster class, so to say. So I want to go over some of the most common mistakes I've seen around when people use Pinia. And also give you some insights on the good practices. Now, I think it's common when we are use of a tool that we map that way of doing that we have in our minds to the new tool. And this is definitely the case for Pinia. People come from Vuex and they want to map some of the things that we're used to in Vuex to Pinia, but it doesn't always work out. To give you an example, when we read state in Vuex, we can read the state through these .state property. So we read it through store.state.isHidden. And when we add a getter, the getter can have the same name as the state, and we read it through .getters.isHidden. Now in Pinia, that's not the case. We have everything through the store. We don't have these intermediate state or getters objects. And so because of that, we cannot have a property in the state and a property in the getters or the actions that are named the same. So this is something that could look very straightforward if you started using Pinia, but for someone who comes from Vuex, I've seen these be a problem very often. State getters and actions should not and cannot have the same name in Pinia. So by the way, getters, as in the example I showed you just before, should have some meaning. They shouldn't just read the state. I don't know why people started creating getters just for reading state, but at the end of the day, getters are supposed to transform or derive the initial data. So for example, if we have an array of products and some filters, then we can have a getter that is the filtered products and is going to use these two pieces of information to give you a filtered array of products. So in short, getters should do something. They should not just return the state. That's pretty much pointless. Now, another thing is mutating state. So we're just reading it, and now when we mutate state in Vuex, we had to go through mutations, right? So mutations will often be these small functions that were just one-liners. We'll just say state.myProperty equals new value. And so you will have all over the code store.commit, the mutation, and then the new value. Now, when mutating over to Pinia, people will transpose these to, just a function set hidden and return that function. In Pinia, we don't have mutations. So this function becomes an action. And then people will just call that function as an action, set hidden false. We don't have commit or dispatch. Now, the thing is, this is completely unnecessary. You can directly change the state in Pinia. You don't need to create these functions, you're only creating technical debt in the future. So it's a good idea to remove these once you migrate over to Pinia. In practice, you can have actions that are just modifying the state, but I would say that they should probably group multiple notations. So in these scenarios, they usually have a meaning, and usually the way you recognize these actions is because you can name them with a business term. So for example, logout, it's probably going to set the user to null, but also maybe do other things, maybe remove a cookie, something like that. And so even if they only set the state, if you can name them, I think it's okay to keep them, but avoid actions that are just set property. Okay, same as you would avoid getters that are get property. That makes sense. In short, I want you to let go of the map state, set user, all these commit, all these uppercase annotations that we had, dispatch, and instead say hello to nice type safety, lightweight, modular stores, and other cool things that come by default just by using Pinia. Okay, moving into the next one, self-sabotage. So when we write some stores, we end up creating versions of the code that are going to hurt us down the line. So we don't see the problems right away, we only see them later. And I think these are really hard to face because it's really frustrating when you encounter a bug that was created by your past self. It's very different from creating bugs and fixing them on the go because you forgot all the context and it's more difficult to debug. Something that I've seen quite often and I'm really surprised is externalizing state. Now this is something that was possible in Vue 2 with data option. I mean, still possible by itself. You could extract an object that is returned in data. But it's not something that I would recommend because it breaks functionalities like SSR. Now, some people do it for TypeScript, and this is very surprising. They just want to type the object. And in Pinia, you should definitely not do this because it has multiple issues. So not only it immediately creates this state instead of delaying the creation until the store is created, but as I said, it doesn't work in SSR at all, okay? So instead, if you want to have the type, maybe you can put that as a return type and then or just return the object. These will work in all scenarios, and it also allows other features like $reset and DevTools integration that allows you to reset the state to work out of the box with no code from your part or whatsoever. Another thing I've seen is read-only state. So this is connected to the way that we used to relate to state in Vuex, where it was read-only. You cannot modify it except by using imitation. And so I've seen people define, for example, a ref, in this case user, and then try all different ways of returning it, like read-only or using a getter or using a computed. But all these three versions have issues. Like the first one, by being read-only, it breaks DevTools, SSRs, and plugins that expect state to be modifiable. A getter is not state, so it's not recognized by Pinia as state, and therefore it cannot apply all the things by plugins, DevTools, and SSR again. And a computer is just a getter, so it's not state and has the same issues that I mentioned before. So how do we do this? Well, the bottom line is you have to return this state somewhere in a store. So if you want, you can prefix it with an underscore, but this won't hide it, of course. Now, if you want to hide it completely, one thing you can do is define an extra store that contains only the private properties. And now you don't export this use private store that you see here. You only use it within your other store that you export. I haven't written here the export in front of use store, but that's the idea, is that you don't expose to the rest of the application this use private store. And so that way you don't need to return user because it's already returned by another store, so it will be handled and recognized as state by Pinia. All right, let's talk about TypeScript. I really like TypeScript, and I think I really went a bit far with Pinia sometimes in the source code to make things type safe and easy to be type safe for the end user. at the cost of a more difficult to maintain code base for Pinia. Now, Pinia should be about type safety and making the type or just writing codes easier for the end user, not harder, and definitely not create problems down the line. So something I've seen very often, I just saw it today again on Discord, is casting an empty object as something else. And you might be thinking, well, is this that bad? Isn't it better than using as any or using a TS ignore? And the truth is, using as any or TS ignore is better, in my opinion, than casting an empty object as something else. Because when we use as any or TS ignore, we are accepting that we were not able to type something in TypeScript to make it type safe, or we're just telling TypeScript to shut up and let us work because we have features to ship. But I like to call these a YOLO cast, and let me explain why. The problem with casting empty objects into something else is most of the time nested properties. If you try to use any nested property from that object somewhere and the object is not initialized, well, you would just face a runtime error right away. And I think this is very problematic because one of the whole points of typing is to avoid runtime errors that can be caught during compilation. So a bit of a shame. So how do we fix it? We use the generics ref, shallow ref, reactive, and we pass this type param, so in this case, user, to ref. Now we have two versions of these. The first one, it doesn't have an argument for ref, so it becomes either user or undefined. And the second one has user or null, and we initialize it to null. So it has one of the two values, whatever you prefer. Now, if we try to access anything, we'll have a TS error. So at least we'll catch that before running into the error at runtime. So the recommendation is very simple. Just don't YOLO cast, okay? And use the generics refs and pass the type param correctly. So by the way, if you're using the option stores, you can define, so in this case, you can cast null as user or null to say, okay, I can accept user or null for this property. Or you can define the whole state as a type and add it as a type annotation on the return type of state. Okay, let's move into new patterns because as we create new ways of doing things with Pinia, it also creates problem, right? So one of them is accessing the store. In Vuex, when we create the store or when we define the store, we are also creating the store. We get that store instance and we can just modify it and read it right away. So in components, we have access to this $store because the store is already created. We need to create it right away. So we have $store in the template and this $store in the component. Now in Pinia, before moving on to Pinia, because of the composition API, we have also this user composable that allows us to access the store without the context, the component in script setup. And then we can just call that whatever we need. Now with Pinia, we only have the composables. This is because Pinia stores are lazily created, right? So we have these model store, use model store, and then we access that directly. So nothing particular here. The important note is we only have the composable version in this example. Now we can use map state and map actions, but that's a different story. But we don't have these $store. It doesn't exist. Now the reason because of this is because we have these composables, and I want just to put this link here. If you haven't read it, it's definitely worth your time. It's on the Vue.js documentation, a guide on what composable is. But I think it's very important to understand what the composable is to correctly use Pinia and also to get the most out of the composition API in Vue 3. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because sometimes I've seen people say, okay, I'm too lazy to call this function use model store. It might not be performant. It is, it just doesn't matter. So they just call it right away after defining the store and they export the store instance instead. Now, and then they get prompted with this error, get active Pinia was called, but there was no active Pinia, which is a bit cryptic. It was improved with a link to the documentation recently. But the point is, you cannot do this. It doesn't work. Not only it doesn't work at all, but it also promotes a pattern that is not good for Composable, doesn't work for Composables. So what you can do is call the use model store after the Pinia is created. You can even call it before using the Pinia plugin, but it's still not what we want to do. You can, as long as you pass the Pinia instance, you will always get the right store. But this is still a weird usage of Composable. It's specific to Pinia for edge cases, so you should not rely into that. And so the reason I'm saying this is because it also allows people, or rather hints people that they can use Composables anywhere when it's not the case. So you end up having code in your code base that looks like this. You have use model store within a watcher or within a function. And while this is going to work on single page applications, it's not going to work correctly on SSR. More specifically, it creates a risk of cross-state pollution, which is just fancy words for saying that your application is not secure anymore for your users' information. So how do we fix it? Well, very simple. We move that outside. We call the use model store in the setup, in the script setup, where it's supposed to be called. And then we just access the model stores anywhere we need. Again, I want to post the same link again. If all of this sounds a little bit alien to you, it's really worth your time to read this page on the documentation. Okay, another place where you cannot call the stories outside in any file right away. But sometimes you need to use that store, for example, in a navigation guard. So here we have the same risk as before. Now, what's weird is that in this scenario, it's actually okay to move that into the navigation guard. And the reason is because the navigation guards have access to an app level context. So that gives access to the navigation guard to the active Pinia, and it makes it independent per application that is running. So in SSR, you have different applications for each request. And so they are all independent. They should not share the state. And every router is specific to each request. And each router is connected to the application. And so that way it knows what context to give to the navigation guard. And that's why we can use the store. So in short, avoid calling stores directly in files, call it in setup, navigation guards, all the composables, and all the stores as well. Next, I want to talk about reactive ref. Now, you might be familiar with this already. The difference between reactive and ref is pretty simple. A reactive object cannot be reassigned, but a ref can. So usually you don't use it for arrays that much. You can use it for collections. I think it's more useful because collections have methods that allows you to completely clear all the entries of it, which is not the case for arrays. So refs can work for everything. Reactive, I would only use it for collections. Now the issue I want to highlight here is in stores. In Pinia stores, if you have a reactive array that you return, so just a state, you will not get an error when you modify the store.items. This is because, well, this is technically possible. You can do it, it's okay. But you end up with two different pieces of state. You duplicated the source of truth. And if you look at the $state, which is the actual state of the store inside of Pinia, which is another topic, a little bit more complicated, but the actual source of truth for all the stores, you have two different arrays of items, which is not good. So instead, you can use reactive on collections. That's fine because usually you don't replace the whole collection with new set. You use the clear methods. But in short, if you want to use an array, better use ref for the store, okay? So reactive for collections and ref for everything else, or just use refs in everything if you prefer. Okay, now into my favorite topic, overusing stores. Now it might sound silly, especially coming from myself because I wrote Pinia to help people, but I still feel like we are overusing stores, and I think I do it myself too, we should not think about the store as the only place of global state. And I'm going to give you a more example. I'm going to not give you the example of passing props onto the store, but I think many of us have seen that in projects. Maybe we have done it ourselves. I'm going to give you a little bit more complicated example. So imagine that you have an application with some projects, and you can select a project, and you have a list of the projects, you select one of them, and then you get the details of the project. So this is a store with handles that part of the logic. Then we see the template, and so we select the project, and then we display the project with a card, and we also display all the other projects. The problem with this approach is that because the selected project is only on the store, if we reload the page, we lose everything. So we might think, okay, let's put it in the URL. And so we move the select project into a local function select project that also pushes into the router the new location. But we duplicated the state. We have the ID of the current project in the URL and the content of the current project in the store. So how do we fix that? Well, we could use the router in the store, because in the store you can use all the composables, and we could use just the list of all the projects to get the actual current project. But this doesn't work in all the scenarios, right? So here I'm using the router, and then I'm using that to find the actual project. And it only works if the list of projects contains all of the project information, which is usually not the case. And if it was the case for my example, I wouldn't need the select project that fetches a specific project. So what do we need to do? We need to move into the select project function. Now we're going to change this a little bit, okay? We are going to have some kind of cache of all the projects with their details in a map, and then we're going to put that into the map every time we select a project. So this is still not good, because we are still not, we still have a function that selects a project instead of reacting to the route changes. So what we do is we move that into a watcher, and select project just becomes a push. So we are pushing to the actual source of truth. We are changing the actual source of truth, which is the URL. And then the watcher is going to fetch the project and return the value and store it. Now we only have one change left to do. Is here we need to get the current from the actual list with details. And now we have a nice solution that does the data fetching, except this works well in SPAs, but doesn't work well on SSR. Now I know SSR is such a pain sometimes, but I still think we learned something, because I'm not going to go into the full details of how to handle the SSR version. We should not look for the stores as the primary place to store global state. I think the router, especially the URL with small piece of state, comes first. Okay, always, if you can think of this order instead, if you can store it into the Vue router URL, or use the URL instead of the store, do it that way. And then think about Pinia, and then maybe some browser APIs. Depends, sometimes it can be before, and then all the libraries. And so this allows me to talk also about how we look at Pinia. We think of Pinia as just global state or stores. And I think that we can also give it a different idea, a different look. So one way I like to look at stores is thinking them of composable singletons. So a composable is a function that encapsulates stateful logic. And a composable singleton will be a way to encapsulate global stateful logic. Let me give you an example about this pattern with some data fetching. Now the idea is we use the store to handle that global state, to handle the cache some way, the cache of the data we're fetching and some of the state. And so I'm skipping all the code here because I only want to focus on the outline of the API. But the idea is that instead of using the store only, we use that store inside of Composable. And in that Composable, we can use other functions that do not exist in the context of a store. For example, unmounted, on-server prefetch, which are specific to components. And this also allows us to use other APIs. So for example, we could define event listeners for focus, online, or visibility change to refresh the data. So to trigger a refresh on the data fetching if it's stale. And then everything else is pretty much the same. This is just an example, it's not a real reference, but of course we can go way more complicated. And if you're interested in that, by the way, I have a course, Mastering Pinia, where we go into all these little details that you don't see in the documentation of Pinia, and with a lot of exercises that are way harder than the classical simple examples in the documentation. So ready to push your limits. And there is I have today a coupon for you, which is $25 off, which is 25 Vue Nation. And I think it should be probably only valid today for the conferences. And that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoy this disaster class for Pinia, and see you around. Thank you.
Wonderful. And thank you, Eduardo, for your talk today. Really appreciate it. We do have a few questions for you. So looking at them, I'm going to see which ones do we want to ask first. We'll go with, what benefits do developers gain from choosing Pinia over just consumables for handling state management? Are you able to hear me? Uh-oh.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, it's weird without hearing Jess. I think my
I'm seeing a lot of questions come in while we're...
computer order died or something. Let me see.
Worst case, just for everybody that's
Yeah,
watching.
that should be good. Okay, I think.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yay! Okay. I was going to say, worst case, I'll just put them on screen and have you answer that way.
Yeah, sorry, I had some issues that I had to run over for a few minutes.
No worries. All right. Well, you didn't hear my thank you then. So thank you for your talk. We greatly appreciate it. And a few questions for you. What benefits do developers gain from choosing Pinia over just consumables for handling state management? Composables.
I think in the talk I do go over a little bit. A composable doesn't solve the same problem as Pinia, as composables are usually scoped for components, so you cannot reproduce the same behavior that a store, namely global state. When you use a composable, you create in local state. Now you can find ways to create global state with composables by using other composables, but then you fall into other cases that do not work with SR or do not have dev tools like Pinia, and all these cases are in the introduction of the Pinia documentation page. So if anybody wants to know the whole list, the list is there in one of the first pages of documentation of Pinia.
Sweet, thank you. And next question, does store.is hidden equals true show as actions in the Vue dev tools for debugging and time travel in there?
It shows in the dev tools, not as an action. It shows as something else because it's not an action.
Good to know. Is there a plan to have the same syntax as script setup in define store?
Currently, no. I think so. This has been in the, how to say, the idea has existed for a few years now. It's just that there is the stores are just JavaScript or TypeScript, differently from Vue components. There is no need to have like a Vue single file component syntax. So if we had a syntax that was similar to script setup for stores, it would make the stores not just TypeScript or JavaScript anymore, So that will require another set of functionalities, tools to make everything work together. So I think it's better to have something that is just JavaScript, even if it's a little bit more verbose.
Thank you. And is there any planning to or existing way to create indexes for complex store state collections in Pinias?
No, I don't think this applies to to Pinia. Indexes are something. I mean, usually
Okay.
it's for database for sorting
Yeah, I was gonna.
and filtering, but
Um,
no, this is something you have to do yourself. I don't think it applies really to Pinia. You do it in the backend more than the front end. Or if you have some kind of database running in the front end, well, you create it at the database level in the front. Maybe with SQLite, you can have some stuff like that. I'm not sure. IndexedDB, I think they have indexes.
Thank you. Um, what are some of the biggest challenges and rewards of working in an open source project like Pinia?
Pinia is not that much complicated compared to, or complicated is not the word, complex maybe, or the scope is very small compared to Vue or even Vue router. So it doesn't. The biggest challenges were at the beginning, I would say. So that would be creating the library, getting it, making sure it was up to date with the RFC for Vuex, that we were working internally with Kia and other members of the team. And then everything that is TypeScript related, it's a bit complex inside of the library itself, the source code. So it was hard to make it a little bit more maintainable, because there is a lot of conditions and a lot of types extensions happening in TypeScript, and it's not the easiest code to write or read, given that in TypeScript you can only use, you have how to explain this. It's very technical, but you some of the times are very complex and they require using ternaries, mostly because that's the only logic condition that you have. You have other ways to create loops, but you have to create objects with indexes. It's a bit weird for someone who hasn't used these before. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges. And the reward is just, I would say it's nice. It's I was gonna say it feels rewarding, but it feels really nice to see the efforts that you pour into a project to be appreciated by the community, and especially with people migrating over from Vuex that were suffering from some of the pain points I was also suffering when I decided to create Pinia. So I think that's the best reward for me, is when you see other people enjoying the library for the same reasons you created. And then you shared it because you thought that other people might enjoy it as well, because you thought that these pain points were not just for you. So this is one main of the reasons I do open source myself. So when I see people using the project I created because it solves the same issues for them that it solved for me, this is the rewarding part for me. This is the most rewarding experience.
Thank you. And that's a great way of hearing it too. So thank you for that. Um, what would you say is the biggest misconception for developers have had about Pinia's functionalities?
Mm, it's a bit hard. I think it would be definitely related to the global state section of Pinia and how it connects to Vuex. Now, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly like something that is tangible. I think
You can.
that maybe because it's global state and a store, people think that they should put a lot of information on the store, and that as soon as they start creating something that is global, and it goes into the store, but then anything that uses that global information easily goes into the store as well, when it is not necessarily the case. And so this is a bit difficult to see when you're developing features. And usually in reviews, in code reviews, other people who haven't worked in the feature can see this more clearly because they realize that some code that is added to the code base is not necessarily needed on the store, but the person added to the store. But when you're working on it, it's a little bit more difficult to see. Now, to name these with a single sentence would be a bit difficult, but that's what I think is the biggest misconception, is overusing the store too much, or thinking that too many things are global, when it's not necessarily about Pinia, but it makes it so easy to add things to it that people add them easily. And it existed too with Vuex, by the way.
Thank you. All right. Should we use factory pattern in composables?
Factory pattern, what was this one? I need to recheck it very quick. I'm really tired, so as some people cannot see by my face. So even if I know my patterns, I don't always use them in JavaScript. Some of them I never use them in JavaScript. I use them more in Java.
I appreciate you
Factory
sharing about
was.
being tired, because I'm very dyslexic. So I realize that
Okay,
sometimes when
factory.
I'm reading the questions, I don't always read them right, and it takes me a few tries.
Okay, so in composables, well, you can. This is gonna sound like for anybody not who didn't ask the question, it's gonna sound like it doesn't make sense. But I think you can. It really depends on the complexity of your front end and how you structure your application and the types, the classes, and well, the factories you create with. Nothing prevents you from using it, especially for state. There are a few issues with SSR that you need to look at if you use classes. And usually when you have factory patterns, you might have classes for performance reasons. It depends on your front end, how many class instances do you create, which is one of the main reasons you want to create class instances instead of just plain objects. So there is a lot to take into account. I don't think you should avoid the pattern initially for any reason. You should be able to use it if you feel comfortable with factory pattern and other patterns in composables, and then other problems you might see down the line, you will find other ways to fix them. Like, for example, performance, although you're probably fixing other problems of performance with the pattern itself, but there is nothing that prevents you from not using patterns with composables.
Thank you. And a few more questions. Is DevTools support possible for composables like how we have for Pinia stores?
I'm not sure I understand that one. The support proposal. How we have for Pinia stores. So Pinia, I mean, I'm gonna answer this the best way I can. In the source code of Pinia, I think most of the code of the source code of Pinia, which is stripped away in production, by the way, is adding things to the DevTools. So adding things to the timeline, adding things, by things I mean adding events to the timeline, adding a view where you can edit the objects, adding subviews to the components to see the stores they are using. And so this is thanks to the Vue DevTools API. Now, so it's using the Vue DevTools API that Guillaume Acrium created. I think, if I'm not mistaken, there is a new version in the works of the DevTools that is a standalone application that looks a lot more like Nuxt, and it integrates it. Is that the good word? It has a retro compatible way of working with that API, but it probably exposes other APIs too, because the view is a bit different. It looks more like Nuxt DevTools, so it's a standalone application that you can run outside. So it's not an extension necessarily.
Thank you.
So if you want to make it work, you have to add that code to your composable to apply it to the DevTools to connect everything together.
Thank you. And last question, doesn't accessing the state directly break the one-way data flow? Shouldn't we use getter and setter?
Yeah, definitely not. You shouldn't. So the second question, the answer is definitely not. You shouldn't use a getter and setter that doesn't do anything here. And the one way data flow isn't sorry, got a call I had to decline. It was pumping in my ears. The thing with that one way data flow is that if you have getters and setters, you're just doing the same thing. If you're writing store.setHidden true instead of store.hidden equals true, is the same thing. It doesn't change a thing, right? The one way data flow I think is more interesting in the components part of the application. For the store, it just creates more verbosity for no reason. And if you consider one way having a function that does the thing instead of doing equal, I don't think that's one way data flow either. So the idea of Pinia for that regard specifically, the mutations that were just set something, is that it was verbose. I think it's explained on the docs in the documentation, but it was verbose and seen as not necessary. So that's why it was removed. And I don't think that specifically breaks the one-way data flow at all. I think it's more the way you use it, but it was more inconvenient to use things like forms, like Vue model forms, and this is totally worth to be able to not have to create workarounds around forms that do not always work in order to bind a state of the store into a form.
Awesome. Thank you. And that was the last question for you. So thank you, Eduardo, for joining us today. We greatly appreciate it.
Thanks. Sorry for the small delay there.
All good. Thank you.